Hello guys, Winston here. A couple months ago, I made a prototype beer flight carrier at the request of a friend. It was board game themed, as that was something memorable from our college days. The board games, not the drinking part. But after making a pair of Catan-inspired flight carriers, I determined that there were several things that were wrong with my design both individually and as a set. First and foremost was the fact that they were impractical to make. Their hexagonal outer profiles and crescent-shaped beer glass partitions meant that they had unnecessarily large perimeters to clean up, so to make the design more efficient, I switched to a square shape. I was already channeling the spirit of Catan with my magnetic drink coasters, and there was no need to double up on the theme. Secondly, my original flights didn't feel that great in hand. I needed to put some rounds on the outside. Thirdly, the best beer flight carriers are not flat-bottomed planks of wood. It's for the same reason that plates shouldn't be flat, because flat surfaces and wet tables are a stupid combination. When I watched David Pacito's video on making a beer flight carrier, he cut out and glued on little feet. This seemed like a great idea to me, but when you have a CNC at your disposal, why use glue? I'd carve feet into the bottom of my flight carriers and in such a way that they would be stackable. Lastly, my first iteration of flight carriers didn't hold beer glasses very well. This surprised me because I designed my flight carriers to be deep enough to contact the bases of each glass where it went vertical. I thought this meant any lateral shifting of the glasses would be countered with the most efficient reaction force. Unfortunately, I screwed up two things. Number one, glass forming, especially in mass-produced items, is not precise. There were a large portion of glasses that my flight carrier didn't optimally capture. Number two, my assumptions about beer glass stability were only valid in static conditions. Given the profile of the beer glasses that we were using, any rotation of the glass would move the CG of the beer further above the glass's contact point with the flight carrier. The optimal point of contact would also move up. Look, ideally no one would ever slosh their beer, but accidents happen, and around board games these things can be catastrophic, so it's best to acknowledge that drinking is a complex physics problem and overthink the solution. In this case, it's to make deeper pockets for secure beer glass capture. So with these design improvements identified, I whipped up a new 3D model and some accompanying G-code. The main cavity was milled with a 1/4 inch end mill for speed. Since I didn't start with a precisely dimensioned piece of wood, when I went to cut out the little feet on the bottom of these flight carriers, I had to flip the piece over and re-zero. For convenience, I chose to use the center of the block as the origin. Not perfect, but it would be close enough. To clean up the floor of the main pocket, I scraped off stray fibers with the back of a box cutter. This doesn't really need to be perfect since it's going to be covered over with an inlay later. To achieve a deeper pocket in my flight carriers, not only did I need to leave a thinner floor in my 3/4 inch pine stock, but my inlay also needed to be thinner. Without a good source of veneers or cheap craft plywoods, and lacking a thickness planer, my only recourse was to face mill my plywood down to a few 1/16ths of an inch thick. I went with the ever-popular Mod Podge transfer technique to put images of Carcassonne game board pieces onto my plywood. These were then glued into the bottom of my flight carriers. I cut out a piece of MDF in the shape of my inlays, but with slightly more material taken off so that they wouldn't be such a snug fit. I used this piece to apply even pressure to my inlays as the glue set. The final step with my Shapeoko was to round over all the outside edges with a 1/16th inch radius bit. I experimented with rounding over the inside edges of the main pocket, but I found that it made the carriers harder to stack. The feet on the bottom needed to be against a hard edge. The final step was to finish with a couple coats of spray lacquer. Ideally, I'd go with a resin type coating to fill all the small gaps around the inlay and make it properly water resistant, but the application typically adds more than a few mils of thickness to the piece, and I didn't think far enough ahead to compensate for that and ensure that it wouldn't interfere with the fit of the beer glasses or stackability of the carriers. Overall, I really like how these turned out, but I still see a lot of room for improvement. The biggest thing I wish I could have changed looking back at my process is to have put more effort into finishing. I need to spend more time with 220 and higher grits of sandpaper to get the walls smoother before I go to sealing. Surface finishes straight out of the CNC rarely match those that you see from traditional woodworking techniques. Other than that minor quibble, I enjoyed this project for the diversity of processes I employed. I think it's 10 times better than my earlier prototypes, and that's just a function of learning from your mistakes. Also, I finally got around to laser etching my magnetic hex coasters and finishing them with spray lacquer. I made 2 sets from different kinds of wood for contrast. Together, these wrap up my current projects for #BoardGamesAndBrews. I want to thank you all very much for watching, and I'll be back with more projects and DIY mayhem in a couple of weeks.